Someone survived an encounter with the man who would later be convicted of multiple murders. She escaped, she spoke, and for a brief moment, the violence paused. What happened next is not dramatic. There was no chase, no immediate arrest, no sense that something irreversible had just been interrupted. Instead, there was hesitation. Her account entered a system designed to assess credibility, categorize risk, and move on to the next case. Nothing in that process was intentionally cruel. But intention, as we will see, is not always what determines outcome. This story is often told as a case about a serial killer. But that framing misses something essential, because the most revealing moments in this case did not occur during the acts of violence themselves. They occurred afterward, in the quiet hours when warnings existed, when patterns were forming, and when the system had to decide how seriously to listen. Tonight, we are not here to relive the crimes in detail. We are here to examine behavior, to look closely at what was done, what was said, and what was left unrecorded. Not to assign blame, but to understand how violence can persist, not through chaos, but through delay, disbelief, and silence. Late 2016, Northern New Jersey. Late 2016 in Northern New Jersey did not feel like a moment on the edge of crisis. It felt routine, predictable, familiar. The region is made up of small cities and transitional neighborhoods, places shaped by movement rather than permanence. People pass through for work, for temporary housing, for a fresh start that may or may not last. These are not places that announce danger, they announce normal life. Bus stops at dawn, convenience stores lit all night, quiet residential streets where nothing seems out of place. Abandoned buildings are part of this landscape, but they are not treated as anomalies. They sit between occupied homes and active storefronts, blending into the background. Locals pass them without pause. They are seen as remnants of economic shifts, not as warning signs. Their presence does not disrupt the rhythm of daily life. It becomes part of it. That rhythm matters. In the mornings, commuters move toward train stations and highways, following schedules that rarely change. Evenings bring predictable routines, returning home, stopping for food, checking phones. Night does not arrive suddenly here. It settles in gradually, accompanied by streetlights and the glow of screens. The environment feels controlled, not chaotic. By 2016, digital life had fully merged with physical life. Conversations began online and continued offline without friction. Meeting someone first through a screen was no longer unusual, it was expected. Social media and messaging platforms did not feel like risky spaces. They felt like extensions of everyday interaction. In this setting, nothing appeared urgent. There were no alarms sounding across the community. No visible disruption to daily patterns. People continued to move through the same spaces, at the same times, with the same assumptions about safety. Even when individuals went missing, their absence did not immediately register as a threat to the wider environment. This lack of urgency is not a failure of awareness. It is a function of normalcy. Crimes, especially repeated crimes, are often imagined as events that erupt from disorder, moments of visible instability or obvious danger. But that assumption is misleading. Most serious offenses do not require chaos to exist. They require opportunity, repetition, and invisibility. Opportunity emerges when environments allow private moments without scrutiny. Repetition becomes possible when behavior blends into accepted routines. Invisibility takes hold when actions do not disrupt the expected flow of daily life. Northern New Jersey in late 2016 provided all three. People were accustomed to seeing strangers, accustomed to temporary presence, accustomed to change that did not demand explanation. In such settings, unusual behavior does not always appear unusual. It often appears merely unremarkable. This is why the setting deserves careful attention. not because it was dangerous in any obvious way, but because it felt safe enough to lower collective vigilance. The absence of visible fear created a psychological buffer, a sense that nothing out of the ordinary was happening, even as patterns were quietly forming beneath the surface. From an analytical perspective, this illusion of ordinariness is not incidental. It shapes how behavior is interpreted, how reports are prioritized, and how long it takes for concern to escalate. When environments feel stable, early warning signs tend to be absorbed rather than amplified. At the time, few people would have described northern New Jersey as a place where a series of violent crimes was unfolding, and that, in itself, is significant, because what allows certain acts to continue is not always secrecy in the dramatic sense. Sometimes it is familiarity, sometimes it is routine, and sometimes it is the quiet confidence that tomorrow will look exactly like today. The case that emerged from this setting did not announce itself all at once. It revealed itself gradually through fragments. Over a period of weeks, multiple women were found deceased in northern New Jersey. Their bodies were discovered in locations that reflected the landscape itself, places that were present but overlooked, vacant structures, private interiors, spaces that did not invite scrutiny because they were already assumed to be empty or transitional. There was no immediate public narrative connecting these deaths. At first, they appeared isolated, separate lives, separate circumstances, separate endings. The details were disturbing but not unprecedented. Each discovery, taken on its own, seemed explainable within familiar frameworks. What complicates this case is not only the number of victims, but the presence of a survivor. One woman lived through an encounter with the individual who would later be convicted. She reported what happened. Her account entered official channels, and then, for a time, the case did not move in the way one might expect. This survival introduces a critical point of tension. Violence had been interrupted, described, and documented, yet it did not immediately reshape the response. Another unifying element would become clear later: social media. The point of contact between offender and victims did not occur in dark alleys or hidden corners of the city. It occurred on widely used digital platforms. Messages exchanged in plain language, arrangements made without secrecy. The virtual space functioned as an ordinary meeting ground, not as an obvious risk zone. From a psychological perspective, this is why the case demands careful analysis. The methods involved were not unusually complex. There were no elaborate disguises, no sophisticated tools, no attempts to create spectacle. The violence itself, while severe, followed a pattern that suggests proximity and control rather than impulsive rage. What stands out is not extremity, but consistency. This consistency points towards something more troubling than individual acts of brutality. It suggests a systematic exploitation of social blind spots. Those areas where behavior escapes attention, not because it is hidden, but because it is familiar. That leads to several core analytical questions. What kind of offender operates in this manner, using ordinary platforms, repeating similar approaches, and remaining present within the same geographic area? What does that repetition suggest about confidence, perceived risk, and psychological comfort? And perhaps most importantly, why did early warning signs fail to escalate into immediate intervention? These questions cannot be answered through timelines alone. They require attention to what is missing as much as to what is present. Silence becomes a central theme. There is the silence of buildings, spaces where events occurred without witnesses, not because no one was nearby, but because the environment itself discouraged attention. There is the silence of delayed reports, where information entered the system slowly, fragment by fragment, without urgency. And there is the silence within early records, gaps, omissions, moments where the documentation stops and inference begins. From an analytical standpoint, silence is not the absence of information. It is a condition that shapes interpretation. It influences which patterns are seen and which are dismissed. It determines how long certain behaviors can continue without challenge. This case, then, is not only about acts of violence. It is about how those acts were able to exist within a framework of normal life, how they aligned just closely enough with expectation to avoid disruption. To understand what happened here, we must look beyond the question of who committed the crimes. We must examine how the environment, the systems involved, and the assumptions carried by everyone around them allowed those crimes to remain unconnected, unremarked, and, for a time, uncontained. Only by doing so can we begin to understand not just this case, but the conditions under which similar cases continue to unfold. Any careful analysis of this case must begin with a clear distinction between what is known and what is assumed. The difference matters. Documented facts provide a framework. Reconstructed moments fill the gaps left behind. Confusing the two can create a sense of certainty that the record does not support. What is documented is relatively consistent across the known incidents. Investigators were able to confirm patterns of contact between the offender and the women who later became victims. Those contacts occurred online through widely used social media platforms. Messages were exchanged openly, using everyday language. There is no indication of coercion at this stage. The communication appears voluntary, casual, and in line with countless similar interactions, happening at the same time across the region. From there, the next confirmed step is agreement. In each case, some form of meeting was arranged. Details varied: time, location, purpose, but the structure remained stable. A decision was made to meet in person. This moment is important because it represents consent to proximity, not to harm. It is also where the digital and physical worlds fully intersect. The final documented element is the move to a private location. These spaces differed in appearance, but shared a defining feature: limited visibility. Vacant buildings, secluded interiors, places that did not attract attention. There is no evidence of forced entry, no indication that victims were compelled into these spaces against their will at the outset. The transition appears seamless, almost unremarkable. What happens inside these spaces is where documentation thins and reconstruction begins. There are no recordings of the final moments. No witnesses who observed the escalation from ordinary interaction to violence. What we infer comes from physical evidence, survivor testimony, and the repetition of outcomes. These sources allow patterns to emerge, but they do not provide a full narrative of each encounter. What stands out across the confirmed and inferred elements is repetition. The setup repeats with minimal variation: online contact, agreement, meeting, privacy. This repetition suggests a process that was tested and refined rather than improvised. Each step aligns closely with socially accepted behavior, making it difficult to identify a clear moment where danger should have been obvious. Equally significant is what is absent. There are no signs of struggle at the point of entry, no reports of neighbors hearing disturbance beforehand, no indications that the victims anticipated immediate harm. From an analytical perspective, this absence matters as much as any documented action. It suggests that the offender relied on compliance shaped by context, not force introduced suddenly. This pattern does not suggest impulsivity. Impulsive violence often leaves traces of disorganization, erratic movement, inconsistent methods, visible panic. Here, the behavior appears measured. The offender remained within familiar routines, using common platforms and ordinary interactions to move toward increasingly private settings. This points toward preparation, not in the sense of elaborate planning, but in the sense of psychological readiness. Preparation within normal routines is often harder to detect than overtly deviant behavior. It blends into everyday life. It does not announce itself as dangerous. It relies on predictability rather than surprise. From a psychological standpoint, repetition also suggests confidence. Each successful encounter without immediate consequence reinforces the belief that the approach is effective and low risk. Over time, that belief can harden into expectation. The behavior becomes easier to repeat precisely because it feels normal. This is why separating confirmed events from reconstructed moments is essential. The confirmed steps show us what was done. The inferred moments help us understand how it may have felt to the offender and to the victims. Together, they reveal a pattern that operates quietly, without spectacle, and without drawing attention until the damage has already been done. In cases like this, the danger is not hidden behind complexity. It is embedded in simplicity. And it is that simplicity, repeated, unchallenged, and familiar, that allows violence to unfold without appearing extraordinary at all. When examining behavior in the early stages of this case, it is important to begin with what appears normal, not because it is harmless, but because normality is often the most effective cover for repeated harm. The communication between the offender and the women he contacted does not initially stand out. Messages were casual, brief, and consistent with the tone commonly used on social platforms. There is no language that clearly signals threat or urgency, no overt manipulation, no pressure that would immediately raise concern. In many ways, these exchanges mirror countless others occurring every day between strangers online. The platforms themselves were also unremarkable. These were not obscure forums or hidden networks. They were widely used applications where people routinely meet, talk, and arrange to see one another in person. From the perspective of both participants, nothing about the medium itself suggested elevated risk. Digital interaction had already become a normalized gateway to real-world contact. This surface-level normality matters psychologically. It lowers internal alarms. When communication fits established social patterns, it is less likely to be questioned. Both trust and complacency can develop quickly when nothing violates expectation. However, when we shift from individual interactions to patterns across multiple incidents, deviations begin to appear. One of the most notable off-pattern elements is consistency in victim profile. While each woman was an individual with her own circumstances, there are shared characteristics that repeat across encounters. These similarities do not imply inevitability or blame. They suggest selection. From an analytical standpoint, repeated selection points toward a decision-making process rather than chance. Equally significant is the choice of locations. The spaces used were isolated, but not unfamiliar. They were not remote wilderness areas or locations that required special access. They were places embedded within everyday geography, abandoned buildings, private interiors, transitional spaces that existed alongside active neighborhoods. These environments occupy a liminal position, not fully public, not entirely hidden. Operating within such spaces may indicate a comfort with ambiguity. These are areas where oversight is limited, but presence is not unusual. People can come and go without drawing attention. For someone intent on avoiding scrutiny, they offer a balance between accessibility and privacy. From a psychological perspective, this combination of consistency and location suggests a possible sense of control, not control through force alone, but control through environment and expectation. The offender appears to have relied on predictability, predictable responses, predictable routines, predictable outcomes. It is important to approach this observation cautiously. We are not diagnosing. We are not assigning definitive traits, but behavior can suggest tendencies. The repeated use of similar approaches may indicate a tolerance for proximity and time. This is not behavior driven by panic or urgency. The offender remained present, engaged, and physically close to his victims. Such proximity requires emotional regulation. It suggests an ability to remain composed while others may be vulnerable or uncertain. This tolerance also extends to repetition. Returning to the same methods, the same types of spaces, and the same general geographic area suggests that the offender did not perceive increasing risk. Each encounter that did not result in immediate consequence may have reinforced the belief that the approach was sustainable. Another early psychological observation lies in what is absent from the behavior. There is little evidence of escalation in method at this stage. No dramatic changes designed to shock or confuse. No attempts to create distance through complexity. Instead, the pattern remains stable. This stability may indicate that the behavior itself was internally reinforcing. When actions are repeated without interruption, they can become routine. Routine reduces psychological friction. Over time, it can blur the boundary between preparation and habit. From an analytical standpoint, these early behaviors suggest someone operating comfortably within social systems rather than outside them. The offender did not need to reject social norms outright. He navigated within them, using their predictability to his advantage. This is why early psychological observations are crucial. They show us not a sudden transformation, but a gradual alignment between behavior, environment, and opportunity. What appears normal on the surface begins to reveal deeper patterns only when viewed across time. And it is within those patterns, quiet, repetitive, and largely unnoticed, that the foundations of continued violence were laid. In many crime narratives, victims are reduced to categories. Labels replace lives, and patterns replace people. That approach may simplify analysis, but it obscures understanding. To examine this case honestly, the victims must be seen first as individuals, each with routines, relationships, and decisions shaped by their specific circumstances. The women involved moved through daily life in ways that were not unusual for their environments. They maintained relationships, navigated unstable housing or employment situations, communicated with friends or family when possible, and relied on familiar routines to create a sense of continuity. Their days were structured not by recklessness, but by adaptation. Each decision reflected an attempt to manage limited options within real constraints. Their last known actions, as far as the record allows us to see, were ordinary. Answering messages, agreeing to meet someone, moving from a public or semi-public space into a more private one. These actions were not taken in isolation. They were embedded in social norms that encouraged trust, especially when interactions appear familiar and unthreatening. None of these steps on their own signaled imminent danger. It is important to emphasize this point clearly. Their decisions made sense within their circumstances. Trust does not emerge randomly. It is often a psychological necessity, particularly for individuals whose lives require frequent interaction with strangers, temporary connections, or informal agreements. And when stability is limited, trust becomes a tool for survival rather than a luxury. Saying yes, responding, showing up, these are often pragmatic choices, not careless ones. From a psychological perspective, vulnerability and trust are not opposites. They frequently coexist. Vulnerability can heighten the need to trust, because without it, daily life becomes unmanageable. This intersection is where risk quietly increases, not because of flawed judgment, but because the margin for error narrows. Avoiding moral framing is essential here. Assigning blame, even implicitly, distorts analysis and reinforces harmful narratives. The question is not why these women trusted, but how their trust was met with harm in an environment that offered few safeguards. Relationships matter in understanding this context. Some victims maintained contact with friends or family intermittently. Others experienced periods of isolation, whether social, economic, or emotional. These patterns are not indicators of weakness. They are reflections of lives shaped by transition and uncertainty. Social isolation, when present, does not cause violence, but it can delay recognition when something goes wrong. Their disappearances did not immediately trigger alarms in every case. That delay is not evidence of neglect by loved ones. It reflects the reality that absence can be gradual. Communication gaps may already exist. Missed messages may not feel urgent at first. Concern grows quietly, often without a clear moment when action feels definitive. Analytically, this matters because it shapes how quickly risk becomes visible. When lives are already marked by inconsistency, change does not always announce itself clearly. The system responds not to potential, but to thresholds, and those thresholds are not evenly calibrated. This leads to a central truth that must be acknowledged without hesitation. Risk is not evenly distributed, but harm is. Certain individuals live closer to risk because of structural conditions: poverty, housing instability, social marginalization, limited access to protection. These conditions do not make harm inevitable, but they increase exposure. When harm occurs, however, its impact is absolute. Violence does not scale itself according to social status. Its consequences are the same. Seeing the victims as individuals forces us to confront this imbalance. It reminds us that their lives were not footnotes to a larger story. They were the story. Their routines, relationships, and final decisions were shaped by context, not by failure. Understanding this does not resolve the case, but it grounds the analysis in reality. It shifts focus away from judgment and toward comprehension of how ordinary lives, navigating constrained choices, can be intersected by extraordinary harm without warning. And it reinforces a necessary reminder: empathy is not separate from analysis. It is a prerequisite for it. The presence of a survivor alters the psychological gravity of any case. It introduces a voice from inside the sequence of events, someone who experienced the encounter and lived to describe it. In this case, her account does not arrive as a dramatic interruption. It arrives as a calm reconstruction of what unfolded, step by step. According to the record, the interaction began in a familiar way. Communication occurred through a common social platform. The tone was casual. Expectations were set in advance. When they met, nothing immediately signaled danger. The early moments aligned with what had already become normalized through digital to physical interactions. As the encounter progressed, the shift was gradual. Privacy increased, control narrowed. The survivor later described moments where discomfort emerged, but not instantly as fear. At the time, she interpreted the situation through the lens of previous experiences: uncertain, tense, but not yet catastrophic. This interpretation matters. People do not assess danger in hindsight. They assess it in real time, with incomplete information and a strong desire for normalcy to continue. When the violence escalated, her response was not instinctive panic, but problem-solving. She complied when compliance felt safer. She resisted when opportunity appeared. Eventually, she survived. That survival was not accidental. It was shaped by situational awareness, timing, and decisions made under extreme pressure. Afterward, she reported what happened. This is where the perspective of the case shifts. Her account entered the system and was processed through established procedures. It was documented, categorized, and assessed according to standards designed to manage volume and risk. The response was not overt rejection. It was procedural framing. Her experience was evaluated within constraints that emphasized corroboration, credibility assessment, and prioritization. From the outside, this can appear as skepticism. From within the system, it may appear as caution. The distinction matters, but so do the consequences. The record suggests delay, not disbelief, but delay has consequences. Psychologically, the impact of discounted or slowed responses extends beyond a single case. When reports do not lead to immediate action, a message is sent, often unintentionally. That message is not only received by victims or survivors, it is also perceived indirectly by offenders. When violence occurs and does not immediately trigger disruption, it may reinforce a belief that the behavior can continue. The absence of swift consequence can be interpreted as confirmation that the environment is permissive. This is not a conscious calculation in every case, but it is a behavioral feedback loop. For the survivor, the delay carried a different weight. Reporting an assault requires trust in systems designed to protect. When that trust is met with hesitation, the psychological cost can be significant. Survivors may question their interpretation, their credibility, or the value of speaking at all. Silence, once again, becomes part of the environment. This moment represents a turning point, not because it resolved the case, but because it could have. With the information available at that stage, intervention was possible. Patterns had not yet fully formed. Outcomes had not yet repeated. The trajectory of events was not fixed, and yet the case did not end there. It moved forward quietly. From an analytical standpoint, this is one of the most instructive elements of the entire case. It illustrates how systems designed to avoid error can inadvertently allow harm to persist. The goal of caution, to prevent false conclusions, can, under certain conditions, delay necessary action. This is not an argument for abandoning procedure. It is an acknowledgement of its limits. The survivor's account forces a reevaluation of how early warnings are weighted. It challenges the assumption that clarity only emerges after patterns are complete. In reality, clarity often exists in fragments, partial, uncomfortable, and easy to set aside. Her survival did not immediately stop the violence, but it reshaped how the case would later be understood. It stands as evidence that the danger was knowable earlier, even if it was not fully recognized. And it reminds us that perspective changes, not when new facts appear, but when existing facts are finally allowed to matter. As the investigation progressed, the most persistent obstacle was not contradiction, but absence. Large portions of the timeline remained unrecorded. Movements went undocumented. Transitions occurred without witnesses. In multiple instances, the record simply stops, and where it stops, inference begins. There are unrecorded movements that cannot be traced with certainty. Short journeys between points of contact and private locations leave no digital trail. Walking routes, brief car rides, moments spent entering or exiting buildings, these intervals are rarely captured unless something visibly disrupts the environment. Here, nothing did. The ordinary nature of movement allowed critical minutes and hours to pass without record. Camera coverage, where it existed at all, was limited and uneven. Some areas were never monitored. Others relied on outdated systems with narrow angles, low resolution, or intermittent operation. Even when footage was available, it often failed to capture decisive moments. Faces turned away, frames obscured, timestamps unreliable. The technology did not malfunction. It simply reflected the boundaries of what was considered necessary to observe. Missing timestamps compound this problem. Without precise markers, sequences blur. Investigators are left to approximate. Before or after midnight, early evening or late night, hours apart or minutes. These uncertainties may seem minor in isolation, but collectively they weaken narrative cohesion. They force analysts to speak in ranges rather than moments, probabilities rather than certainties. Again and again, the same phrase appears in the file. The record is silent on exact times, silent on routes taken, silent on who may have seen something but did not recognize it as relevant. This silence is not accidental. It is produced by environments that do not expect to be scrutinized and systems that document selectively. Most places are not designed to preserve memory. They are designed to be passed through. For families, this absence has a distinct psychological effect. Gaps invite imagination, and imagination is rarely gentle. Without clear answers, loved ones are left to reconstruct final hours repeatedly, testing possibilities against fragments of information. Each unanswered question becomes a point of fixation. The lack of data does not create closure. It sustains uncertainty. For investigators, the impact is different but equally profound. Absence constrains interpretation. Without confirmation, conclusions must remain provisional. Time that could be spent advancing the case is redirected toward validating assumptions. Momentum slows. Confidence erodes. The investigation becomes an exercise in managing what cannot be known. Silence in this context is not neutral. It does not simply represent missing information. It actively shapes focus. Attention drifts toward what is documented, often the most visible or easily categorized elements, while less tangible factors fade. Patterns that require continuity are harder to establish. Connections that depend on precise timing remain speculative. This redirection has consequences, for when attention is drawn away from subtle consistencies, behavior that relies on repetition can persist longer. The absence of clear linkage between events allows each incident to stand alone, delaying recognition of a broader pattern. Aiding from a psychological perspective, silence also affects perception of risk. When data is sparse, urgency is harder to justify. Decisions are postponed while clarity is sought. Yet clarity rarely arrives on its own. It must be constructed from incomplete material. The weight of absence presses on every layer of the case. It influences how families grieve, how investigators proceed, and how systems evaluate priority. Silence becomes a structural force, one that does not announce itself, but steadily redirects attention away from emerging threats. In the end, what is missing tells its own story, not of concealment or cleverness, but of environments and systems not designed to notice quiet harm. Understanding this does not fill the gaps, but it explains why they exist and why, once present, they are so difficult to overcome. To understand how this case unfolded, it is necessary to look beyond individual decisions and examine the structure in which those decisions were made. Investigations do not occur in isolation. They move through systems shaped by volume, limitation, and prioritization. Within those systems, friction is inevitable. Law enforcement agencies in the region were managing heavy caseloads during this period. Violent crime was not rare, and resources were distributed according to perceived immediacy and solvability. Each new report entered a queue alongside dozens of others, all competing for attention. Investigators were required to assess threat, credibility, and urgency quickly, often with incomplete information. Caseload volume affects perception. When many cases present similar levels of ambiguity, none stand out clearly. Patterns are harder to detect when incidents are dispersed across jurisdictions or categorized differently. A single report, even one involving serious violence, may not trigger escalation if it does not immediately connect to others. Resource limits further constrain response. Investigative time is finite. Specialized units are limited. Surveillance, forensic analysis, and follow-up interviews require funding, personnel, and justification. In cases where evidence is partial or delayed, the cost of deeper inquiry can appear disproportionate to the likelihood of immediate resolution. This is not indifference. It is triage. Technology also played a role. In late 2016, digital forensics and data integration were advancing, but unevenly. Social media platforms were not yet fully optimized for rapid law enforcement access. Data requests took time, location tracking was inconsistent, cross-platform analysis required coordination that systems were not always designed to support. Information existed, but not always in usable form. Beyond logistics, cultural and social factors shaped investigative pathways. Bias does not always manifest as overt prejudice. Often, it appears as assumption. Certain reports are unconsciously framed as less urgent based on who is speaking, how they speak, and how closely their experiences align with institutional expectations. Credibility hierarchies emerge. Some voices are treated as reliable by default. Others require corroboration before action. These hierarchies influence prioritization. When reports come from individuals already navigating social marginalization, their accounts may be processed more cautiously. Caution, again, is not disbelief, but it slows momentum. And in cases involving repeated harm, time is a critical variable. It is important to reframe this dynamic carefully. This case does not suggest widespread failure by individual investigators. There is no clear evidence of neglect, malice, or intentional disregard. Instead, what emerges is friction within systems, points where procedure, limitation, and assumption intersect. Systems are designed to manage risk efficiently, not to account for every anomaly. When a case does not immediately fit established patterns, it may drift. Follow-up is delayed. Connections are missed. Over time, the absence of new information reinforces the perception that the case is static. This is how a case becomes cold, not suddenly, not dramatically, gradually. A cold case is rarely the result of a single missed opportunity. It is the cumulative effect of small delays, deferred actions, and unresolved questions. Each pause feels reasonable in isolation. Together, they slow the investigative process until momentum dissipates. Understanding this progression matters because it shifts the focus from blame to structure. It asks not who failed, but where systems are strained. It acknowledges that even well-intentioned processes can produce unintended outcomes when operating under pressure. From a psychological perspective, this gradual cooling has consequences. For families, it signals diminishing hope. For investigators, it narrows the range of possible actions. For offenders, it may reinforce a sense that their behavior remains undetected. Recognizing these constraints does not excuse harm, but it clarifies how harm can persist within ordinary systems. It reminds us that resolution depends not only on evidence, but on the capacity to see significance before patterns become undeniable, and it underscores a difficult truth. Cases rarely become cold because nothing happened. They become cold because too much happened, too quietly, within systems stretched thin. Eventually, the case reached a point of legal resolution. An arrest was made, charges were filed. The process moved from investigation into the courtroom, where facts were organized according to legal standards rather than analytical ones. The arrest did not arrive as a sudden revelation. It followed the accumulation of evidence, testimony, and digital records that could be presented coherently before a judge and jury. From a legal perspective, the threshold was finally met. Responsibility could be argued, defended, and adjudicated. The trial that followed focused on what the law requires: proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Witness accounts were examined, forensic evidence was presented, patterns of contact and movement were established to the extent that records allowed. The survivor's testimony carried particular weight, grounding the case in lived experience rather than abstraction. In the end, a verdict was reached. A sentence was imposed, long enough to ensure that the individual convicted would not return to the community. From the standpoint of public safety, this outcome matters. It marks a definitive end to the offender's capacity to cause further harm through direct action. But legal resolution is not the same as understanding. A verdict confirms responsibility. It establishes that specific acts occurred and that a specific person was accountable for them. It satisfies the requirements of justice as defined by the criminal system. What it does not do is explain origin. The court does not determine why a person developed these behaviors, only that they carried them out. Motive is addressed only insofar as it clarifies intent, not psychological formation. Background factors, internal states, and long-term behavioral development remain largely outside the scope of judgment. This distinction is important for analysis. There is a natural temptation, once a case concludes legally, to search for a final explanation, to believe that conviction equates to closure. Psychologically, this impulse is understandable. Certainty offers relief. It draws a boundary around uncertainty, but restraint is necessary. Speculating beyond the record risks replacing evidence with narrative. Assigning origins without data can distort understanding and inadvertently simplify complex human behavior into convenient conclusions. In this case, there is no comprehensive psychological profile available that explains how these patterns emerged or why they persisted in the way they did. What we can say, based on the record, is limited, and that limitation must be respected. The offender's behavior demonstrates repetition, control, and comfort within certain environments. It suggests familiarity with social systems and an ability to operate without attracting immediate attention. These observations help frame behavior, but they do not define its cause. The legal process does not require such definitions. It requires accountability. For families, the sentence may offer a form of stability. Knowing that the offender is no longer free can reduce ongoing fear. Yet even here, the absence of deeper explanation can leave questions unresolved. Justice answers what happened and who is responsible. It does not always answer how a life intersected with violence in this way. For analysts, this moment marks a transition rather than an end point. The legal conclusion closes the case procedurally, but analytically, it highlights the boundary between proof and understanding. Recognizing that boundary is an act of discipline, it prevents overreach, it preserves accuracy, and it reminds us that the role of analysis is not to complete the story, but to clarify what the story can and cannot tell us. In this case, the law delivered a definitive outcome. That outcome protects the public and affirms responsibility. But it leaves intact the deeper, more uncomfortable truth that human behavior does not always arrive with clear origins, and that certainty in court does not erase ambiguity in understanding. Accepting that distinction is not a failure of analysis. It is one of its most important conclusions. As this analysis draws to a close, what remains is not a sense of completion, but a careful accounting of what can and cannot be known. The distinction matters. It shapes how we remember the case and how we apply its lessons beyond the confines of a single narrative. We know certain things with confidence. We know that multiple women lost their lives. We know that one woman survived and reported her experience. We know that contact occurred through ordinary digital platforms, followed by in-person meetings that moved into private spaces. We know that these events were not isolated accidents, but part of a repeated pattern that ultimately led to arrest, trial, and conviction. These facts are established in the record. They form the foundation of any responsible analysis. Beyond that foundation lies inference. From repetition, we infer deliberation rather than impulse. From the choice of locations, we infer comfort, operating within spaces that are neither fully public nor fully hidden. From the absence of early disruption, we infer that the behavior aligned closely enough with social expectations to avoid immediate detection. These inferences are not conclusions. They are interpretive tools, grounded in observable patterns but open to revision. And then there is what remains unknown. We do not know precisely when the behavior began or how long it developed before being noticed. We do not know what internal narratives shaped the offender's sense of permission or risk. We do not know how many warning signs were present but unrecognized, or how many moments could have unfolded differently under altered conditions. The record is silent on these questions. and speculation cannot fill that silence without distorting it. This uncertainty can be uncomfortable. It resists the desire for resolution that often accompanies true crime stories. But discomfort has analytical value. The purpose of this examination has never been to solve what has already been adjudicated. It has been to understand how behavior and systems intersect, how ordinary routines, limited oversight, and delayed responses can align in ways that allow harm to continue. Understanding behavior helps us see patterns before they become obvious. It allows us to recognize that violence does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it moves quietly, supported by familiarity and repetition. Understanding systems helps us see how cases evolve, not through single failures, but through accumulations of delay, absence, and constrained decision-making. Analysis does not replace closure. Closure is personal. It belongs to families, to survivors, to communities affected by loss. It cannot be manufactured through explanation alone, but analysis serves a different function. It helps us recognize patterns before they repeat. It reminds us that silence is not empty, that normalcy can conceal risk, and that unanswered questions are not analytical dead ends. They are signals, indicating where attention once faltered and where it must be sharpened in the future. The unresolved nature of this case is not an invitation to fear. It is an invitation to awareness, to listen more carefully, to question assumptions about safety, credibility, and urgency, to accept that some stories end without full clarity, yet still demand our attention. In the end, living with unanswered questions is not a failure of understanding. It is an acknowledgement of complexity. And in that acknowledgement lies the quiet, enduring value of analysis itself.